I'm Trish Scorpio, and I work for the Integrated Communications team at Midwest Dairy, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for our webinar today. I'm really excited to present this topic. And as you know, Midwest Dairy 7,400 Western states. We work on behalf of dairy farmers to increase dairy sales, and inspire consumers in dairy products and practices. So we're pleased to be hosting today's webinar on the topic of putting biotechnology in context for your customers and your consumers. And on the phone, just to give you a sense of who is participating, we have folks from Midwest Dairy staff, we have health and wellness experts, we have industry and government leaders, retailers and manufacturers. Please join us today. This is part of an ongoing consumer confidence webinars that we've been hosting for about the last year and a half or so. So thanks for your ongoing support, and if there are other topics that you would like us to consider, please feel free to forward those our way. I am really excited to introduce this morning's speaker who will share her perspectives and help us put this challenging concept, this challenging topic of biotechnology use in agriculture in context for the various conversations that we have in the course of our day. Our speaker today is Lisa Watson, and she recently joined the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, and in this capacity, she serves as an ambassador to tell dairy stories and really industry against some key goals, and her really the overall goal again is to build in dairy. She's also the principal and founding partner of Watson Green LLC, which is based in Washington, D.C. And her focuses on enhancing public acceptance of food and agricultural technologies, which is why she's perfect for our conversation today. She has published extensively, spoken widely on nutrition, biotechnology, and risk communication. And for those of you health and wellness professionals on the phone, Lisa is also a member of the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics and associate member of the American Society for Nutrition. So as we kick off our discussion, I wanted to let you know Lisa will present for about the next 45 to 50 minutes, and then we're going to reserve some time at the end for questions. So jot those down, and we can coordinate those at the end. So now I'll turn it over for Lisa for her to share her remarks.
Thanks so much, Trish. I appreciate it. And I'm going to back up to the title side just for a minute to show you that I have some standing in this area. I want you to know that this is actually a shot of cucumbers from my garden last year. So I do grow a little food myself, although it's a plot that's about probably smaller than any of your bathrooms. Before starting, I just want to make a couple of comments about the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, where I work. The Innovation Center was formed in 2008 by dairy farmers through the checkoff to bring together the power of the whole dairy chain, from farmer to company to grocer to supplier to NGO to trade organization. And we focus on priorities that are pre-competitive in nature, working to ensure an economically viable and a socially responsible dairy community. So through that, we're committed to continuous improvement, promoting best practices and accountability, and we always have the consumer right at the center of that bullseye. Our board of directors are the CEOs of the groups that you see here, these logos. It gives you an idea of the scope of involvement of the Innovation Center. But you don't have to be a CEO to get involved in the IC. We have 7 committees and a bunch of task forces that focus on different areas and challenges and opportunities. Our Sustainability Alliance, if you're not already involved, is a broad multi-stakeholder group where we collaborate on progress toward our goals. We have one of our 2 meetings at the end of June in Chicago, so I invite you all to come to that sustainability forum. And then Common Voice is a network of our communicators, and we convene and work together to find the best ways to tell dairy's good story. So I would encourage you all to go to usdairy.org to get more information if you're not already involved or if you'd like to be more deeply involved. So moving on, I always open with this slide, and when I talk about agricultural biotechnology, it's impossible to get a conversation going because everybody's talking too much. So before we get to talking, let's go through a few semantics here. So if you're somebody like me who has been plugging away in this area for 25 years, you're probably going to call this technology agricultural technology. If you work for FDA or USDA or EPA and you've been writing regulations for these policies for the last 25 years, you're probably going to call it genetic engineering or bioengineering or possibly transgenics. If you're a young scientist who is doing cutting-edge research right now in the lab, my bet is that you're doing more work in gene editing than you are in transgenics today, and we'll talk a little bit about what that difference is later. But if you're coming to this based on media reports or what you see on the shelves of your grocery store, you probably call it the dreaded GMO. Now, there are nuances of meanings to each of these terms, but the common denominator is that we're giving a plant or some other living thing a value-added trait through a genetic change. And that would be a genetic change that would be difficult to achieve through just what we would call traditional breeding practices. So that's the basic definition. Now, that may sound pretty simple from a scientific perspective, but this is one of these topics where science and consumers are not particularly aligned and in fact are somewhat at odds. With that said, we do find that more than half of consumers say that they are at least somewhat familiar with the debate. But if you look at that percentage down there at the bottom, 15%, that's a pretty low number who say they're very familiar. And all of the data that I'm showing here are 2015 and 2016 data. The striking thing to me about this issue is that of everything that I've worked on over the course of my career, this is one that just defies demographics. So I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but what I can tell you is that if you look closely, you'll see that whether we are looking at race or level of education or party affiliation or a liberal versus conservative, none of those are real predictors of how you're going to feel about the safety of GMOs, which is quite unusual for issues like this. So we can't do a lot of demographic targeting if we're trying to reach out to the individuals who we feel have the most concerns. There is one indicator, though, that is a really good predictor. Pew did a study in 2015, and they surveyed just general U.S. adults, and they looked at members of the AAAS. So that, AAAS is the Academy of Sciences. That is the cream of the cream when it comes to the scientific community in the U.S. And here they found a bigger disparity in opinion on this issue than of any of the issues that they looked at. So we do know that there's a big gap here. And interestingly, if you go to people in America and you say, do most scientists agree that genetically modified foods are safe to eat? Only 14% are going to answer yes to that question. So consumers don't really know what scientists think either. This is just one other slide. This question asks a little bit differently about how much people have heard about genetic modification. You get about 29% who say they've heard a lot. You got a half who say, well, they've heard something. And interestingly, though, when you ask them how much they care about the genetically modified foods issue, you only get 16% who say they care a great deal. And I think, I just observed a set of focus groups in Chicago on this topic, and I would say that came through. Now, it's not a top-of-mind issue for most people. However, once you raise the issue and it comes up, you do get a lot of people who will kind of go along. And they believe that this is something that they don't know what GMO stands for, but they think that it's something that they're supposed to avoid. And if it wasn't, why would it appear on food labels, no GMO? So it must be something that we need to watch out for. Consistent with these findings, and I would call your attention mainly to this 58%, there is a sense of uncertainty. So people don't really know what it is or what it does or why it's there, but they sense that it's the unknown that is worrisome to them. So today we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We won't go too deep into any of these areas, but the bottom line is when you walk out of this webinar, you're not going to be one of those 58%. You are going to be in the group that says you do understand GM, because we're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of this. And the goal here is so that you will have a better context when you get questions from customers or from consumers or neighbors about this technology and what it is. So the fact is, and you probably all know this, is that agricultural evolution began hundreds and hundreds of years ago. This is a picture of what I am guessing is a Mayan farmer who is collecting pollen from the top of one strong corn plant so they can make that with pollen from another strong corn plant. And why is he doing that? He's doing that because he knows that if he does that, he's going to get plants that are strong with the kinds of traits he's looking for. And in fact, that is the whole history of agriculture. Today's crops are radically different than the crops that they came from, if you will. Teosinte is the ancient Mexican corn. You can get an idea on scale here in terms of what the ears of corn looked like in Teosinte versus the modern corn that we have today. And this is just another kind of blowout of that same diagram. And it's not just true for corn. Virtually all plants have been extensively genetically modified from the original form. There's virtually nothing you could pass by in your produce aisle today that is not very, very different from whence it came. It's the case in wheat. Here's carrots, whether you're talking tomatoes, peppers, strawberries, just about anything. Now, so we know that traditional breeding involves genetic change, and all of these things, again, just another example here of change, they may not have changed through tools of modern biotechnology, but genetically they're different than their ancestors. So why biotech then? If we can get there by just breeding, why are we going through this process of biotech? I love this slide because you could, I won't do it, but you could talk for a half hour on just this slide. I'm going to call your attention to the bottom quadrant where, in one case we've got a little larva feeding on a corn root. We've got a corn stalk that's fallen over, and these are different critters that are problems for corn. Corn rootworm does exactly what you would expect. It chews up the roots of the corn plant. And what happens when a corn stalk doesn't have roots? It falls right over in the field. You don't get any corn. The corn borer will bore up through the stalk, and you see this on kind of at 3 o'clock here on the slide. And what happens when there's no middle to the stalk of corn? The corn doesn't get nutrients and just breaks off. You don't get any corn. When insects feed on the leaves of corn or other plants, it opens up vulnerability for them where disease can get in. And again, you get low yield and low return on these in these plants, as you can see in the very bottom right-hand side. So in the past, what did we do to control these types of insect pests? We sprayed massive amounts of chemicals over the top of the fields because that was necessary to do. Now, through modern biotechnology, we've been able to give these plants a gene that makes a protein called Bt. Bt is a natural pesticide that's used very widely in organic farming over the top of plants. Here we do the same thing, except we've given the plant to make it and express it at the place where particular insects are likely to attack, and it's a natural insecticide. So that's the insect side. If you look on the left-hand side here, the top, probably at about 11 o'clock on the page, this is actually a field of soybeans, but it's a field of soybeans that has gone untreated for weeds. What do weeds do in a field? Why do farmers care so much about them? I think you can see here that there's no way soybeans in this field are going to get light. They're not going to get water. The weeds are going to compete for nutrients. If the farmer can get some soybeans out of this field, it's going to be full of weed seeds and other trash. So farmers have to control for weeds. The slide below is a picture, the photograph below with nice clean rows. That is a picture of probably a Roundup Ready field of soybeans. Here, these plants have been given the ability to make a protein. That means that when Roundup is sprayed over the top or glyphosate, those plants will still live. So basically, the farmer can wait for weeds to come up in the field. He can do a spray of glyphosate, and the fields will be controlled from a weed perspective. The advantage of this, in addition to good weed control, is that these types of systems are much more compatible with conservation tillage and processes in the field that allow us to conserve soil, allow us to conserve water. So there's huge environmental benefit to this type of a system in the field. Now I'll move up to the top here, a modern problem that we have. You probably all have heard about the challenge of citrus greening. This is a disease that is carried by insects, and it gets inside the plant. It is threatening today to wipe out our entire Florida citrus industry. We may have a technology fix for it, just like what we did with the Hawaiian papaya, where we can introduce a protein that will protect against this disease. But, you know, there are a lot of people who are concerned about using that technology because they're worried that the marketplace, whether it's a consumer who has concerns about biotechnology being used, or whether it's a marketer who's trying to create a niche market by not having used the technology. So there are people who are concerned about applying the technology to citrus, but it is a huge problem that we need a solution to, and we need that solution sooner versus later. So if we think about the kinds of challenges that are facing farmers today, we talked about a lot of them: insects, weeds, disease, drought, soil quality, extreme weather. And what do all of these challenges have in common? They affect yield and return on investment. And in today's competitive environment, the farmer simply has to always work to make sure that he or she is getting the yield that he needs and return on the investment, as well as managing the resources of that farm in a way that he or she can continue farming for year after year. These challenges and this come at a time when our global demand for food is increasing. Estimates are that we need to increase food production by about 70% by 2050. You've all seen these numbers. And because of the increasing socioeconomic status in many developing parts of the world, that is going to need to be with protein and nutrient-rich foods. So what would be the consequences of completely walking away from biotechnology today? We know that there will be environmental consequences. This is a study that was, published in 2014. A version of that actually just came out, an updated version last week with similar numbers. We would need about another 11% of arable land in the U.S. to make up for the yield loss to get the same yield if we walk away from biotechnology. This would be the equivalent of converting our entire U.S. park system to farmland. And I think that the challenge here is that if you look globally, much of the land that we do have available for farming is already being farmed. So we're looking at pushing into either taking down, like rainforests, if you're talking about Latin America, or pushing production into areas of marginal yield where you're going to have to really go intensive with your inputs to get that land to yield in the way that you would, the level where you would need it to be comparable to other lands today. There are also implications in terms of the carbon footprint. Biotech crops have helped farmers reduce CO2 emissions by about 60 billion pounds in 2015. I did not put a slide together on this, but that's about the equivalent of pulling 12 million cars off the road. Can we get there without biotechnology? I don't know of anyone who would say that biotechnology is a silver bullet toward addressing the challenges that we face in agriculture and in food production going forward. But we do have to recognize that in this world, we have a finite amount of land and a finite amount of water, and we really need to be looking at the best tools across the toolkit to meet these needs if we want to be responsible with our resources. They're doing incredible things with precision agriculture today, where a computer or an app can literally tell a farmer what part of a field needs water or what part needs fertilizer. They're doing great things with seed and plant breeding and coated seeds, and also looking at new crop protection devices. But at the same time, biotechnology has made a big contribution, not just for farmers, but for consumers who care about the environment and care about our natural resources. So I think most experts would say we need a combined approach going forward. Many of you may be saying, so you work for a dairy, why are you talking about biotechnology? Cows are not genetically modified, milk is not genetically modified, why do you care? I would say that this is an important issue to our farmers because 90+% of the feed that our cows eat and beef cattle and other animals eat is genetically modified with some of these traits that I just shared with you. There certainly are issues in terms of just the way that grain and seed move. If you start trying to segregate seed from one farm to another, there's a certain cost in terms of agronomic and economic benefits and environmental benefits and overall cost. I've talked with dairy farmers who have told me that they simply don't understand why they need to go back to old ways of doing things when technology has given us better ways, and that they really don't want to send their children into the field that their grandfathers had to farm with more dependence on chemical inputs. Also, just two other points about dairy. The enzymes that we use in cheese production, these are made through bacterial fermentation. We use bacterial fermentation when we make wine, when we make bread, when we make beer, but it's also used to make the enzymes that are necessary in cheese production. In the past, we actually had to extract an enzyme from the stomachs of animals for this process in cheese making. Now we've got fermentation processes that will do this for us in a very efficient and very clean way. And certainly if you look at ingredients that are in dairy foods, sweeteners or other products that are in foods that are made with or contain dairy, many of these come from commodity crops that have been modified with certain traits. So what kind of adoption have we seen to date? Well, let's first talk about what the technology has meant to farmers. This is a 2014 meta-analysis. It looks back over 20 years of crop production. And you see here that pesticide quantity has gone down by about 37%. That's been more pronounced in the insecticide area versus the herbicide area. And it certainly has been more pronounced in certain crops than others. If you look at cotton, which is a highly intensive crop for insecticide use, 43% drop in volume of active ingredients sprayed over cotton fields. That was 2015 data. So I think you can understand in looking at this, you do get some yield improvements generally, and that's more of a protection against yield loss, frankly, in most cases. But all of these contribute to a profitability as well. Global adoption, there has been incredible intake. When this technology first started, we used to often have to answer questions from those who felt that this was simply a technology for developed areas and it was going to put developing areas at a disadvantage for agriculture and was going to shut them out of markets. I think you can see here that has not been the case. If you look over at 2011, that's where the lines crossed, and we actually have more acreage in developing areas than in the developed world as of 2011. If you think it's not important in developing areas, this is a photograph of farmers who are waiting in line to purchase Bt cotton seeds in one of the states in India. So very, very strong demand in these areas because they see the return that they are getting. In fact, in developing areas, again, this is the study that just came out last week looking at 2015 data. For every dollar that's spent on genetically modified seeds, it yields $5.15 in return in developing areas, and that's actually a greater return than you would see in developed areas. That return is about $3.45. Top 4 crops: corn, cotton, soybeans, canola, but many other crops as well. Some of these are in the U.S., some are in other countries. So how does it work? And we'll try and go through this pretty quickly, but just to give you an idea. First of all, it doesn't always work. It's not an answer to every problem. But typically the way agricultural science would define a particular problem, they think about different solutions to that problem, including what the safety of those different solutions are. And if it's a situation where ideally, for example, expression of a protein by a plant, I'll talk in terms of plants here, is what's desired, and that may be a protein that the plant already produces or a different plant produces. But if you can then find a genetic source of that protein that you think addresses this problem, then you can insert the gene for that protein into plants, and then you grow up lots of little plantlets to see what comes up and what thrives, and then obviously do a lot of testing on those plantlets. But just to make it a little bit simpler here, and you've probably seen this type of a diagram before. We've used it for years, but let's think about that orange plant on the left as being a tomato plant, and that little red gene is desired because it is a gene for terrific flavor. Now, this is an oversimplification, obviously, because there are lots of genes that affect flavor, but let's just say this is a silver bullet flavor gene that's in this tomato plant. But the downside is that plant on the left is not so hardy, and it's very susceptible to disease and drought, and you only get a single tomato on average off of every plant that's grown. And then if you think about the plant on the right, which we're calling recipient variety, that is just the strongest tomato plant you've ever seen in your whole life, and it averages 30 tomatoes per plant, and it grows up in all kinds of bad weather, but the tomatoes just taste like cardboard. They're horrible. So traditionally, we would breed these two tomatoes together to try and get that good tasting tomato gene into the high yielding plant. And we might be successful at doing that after we bred it a few times, but we'd also get a lot of other baggage going over. So this on the right represents that high yielding tomato plant, and the tomatoes taste really good, but we got the baggage of disease susceptibility and susceptibility to weather. So obviously that's not what we want, and it would take lots and lots of work to try and outbreed those other characteristics to get what we want. But if we could identify and pull out that desired gene for the good taste, and we could shoot it over into this high-yielding plant, then ideally what we would end up with is a plant that yields lots of tomatoes, that is hardy in weather conditions and resistant to diseases and yields very good tomatoes. So that's the whole idea behind it. So once you get that transformation made, which we just saw in the little Petri dishes, then everything is just like any type of seed breeding. You're going to plant the seeds. You're going to see how they work in the field and different weather options, you know, how viable they are, what the quality is. In the case of biotechnology, you're going to have to complete a lot of regulatory hurdles, though. You've got to work through USDA and EPA and FDA to make sure that you've looked into all the questions around human safety, animal safety, environmental assessments. If you did this through traditional breeding, you wouldn't have to do any of this stuff in terms of the safety testing. But with biotechnology, you do have to complete these regulatory hurdles. And once you've completed those, you can bulk up the seed and go to farmers to market. I mentioned gene editing at the very beginning, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but the scientists are telling us that this is really the technology of the future. In fact, it was named the technology of the future at the end of, or the scientific breakthrough for 2015. There's not an issue. We actually get Science magazine here in the office, and there's not an issue that comes through that doesn't have something about CRISPR or RNAi or TALEN in it. This simply allows scientists to, it's not a transgenic technology, so it's going in, and for example, if you want a plant to make more of a certain protein, because again, let's use the tomato example, because that protein makes the tomato taste better, you can go in and edit the genome so that that gene is replicated within the cell. Or maybe if there is a gene that is responsible for some toxic element in the plant, you can go in, snip that gene out, and it makes that genetic change in subsequent generations of the plant. So this obviously has huge implications for both medical and opportunity-wise in the human health area, but it's also being looked at very strongly in agriculture. In terms of safety, we operate in the United States under the coordinated framework, which simply means we got 3 organizations that are working together to assure safety and to oversee as these plants are developed and brought to market. USDA is in the early stages. It looks at things like you know, whether or not there's going to be any environmental risk potentially associated with the plant. Are we going to be bringing in another kudzu, for those of you who remember that in the South, or is it going to outcross with other plants? So those types of tests need to be done, submitted to USDA. EPA is only involved if there's a pesticidal component to the plant. So our tomato that we talked about would not have had to go through an EPA review, because we're not talking about introducing the ability of the plant to withstand insects, or, you know, or we're not putting an herbicide over the top of those plants where it wasn't, you know, wouldn't have been in the original approval for the herbicide. So those are the kinds of things that EPA does, and EPA also looks at human, most people don't know this, but if a pesticide is involved, they look at human safety and safety of non-target organisms and living things as well. And then FDA, as you would imagine, looks at both food and feed safety. This is done on a consulting basis, although I don't think there's a single product that has come through where a company has not gone through this consultation process. They would be crazy to do that. FDA looks at these data based on substantial equivalence. That means that they're looking at, if you bring forward a soybean, is the soybean with this trait of herbicide tolerance or insect protection, is it still a soybean? Does it have the same safety characteristics as the traditional soybeans? Does it have the same nutritional content? Does it have any watch outs for special populations? Is it any reason to think that it's more allergenic than traditional soybeans? So those are the kinds of questions that FDA looks at in detail. If they see that these products are, the same as the traditional product, they write a letter to the company and say, we think that this soybean is substantially equivalent to other soybeans on the market and does not present any new risk for people, or in the case of animals, if it's a feed use for animals. Safety is not among experts, is really not debated today. If we're talking, that doesn't mean that every new product needs to be looked at for safety, but in terms of the products that are on the market now, these are just, examples of 10 of the global organizations that have stood behind the safety of the crops that are available today. And in fact, in 2016, the NAS issued a huge, huge report that concluded the committee found no differences in terms of risk to human health, any different from any non-GE counterparts. Okay, so labeling, the kind of the issue of the day. Food labeling is, as you know, under the purview of the Food and Drug Administration. And in terms of these foods, historically it was not required if it was substantially equivalent to the counterpart. So if you got one of those letters from FDA, there was no mandatory labeling of a crop that contained an ingredient from a genetically modified plant. If though the crop, and there have been crops that have been developed for a lower saturated fat content or higher levels of a particular nutrient or anti-browning in the case of the apple. So for those products, because they are different, they have some trait that is different from a nutritional or a quality perspective in the counterpart, those were required to have some type of disclosure. So that was up until recently. Fast forward to around 2012, 2013, 2014, there were a variety of states, California, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, and probably some others, that were looking at mandatory labeling of foods that were genetically modified or with genetically modified ingredients. And none of those initiatives passed until May 2014 when it passed in Vermont. So they gave a 2-year window, but it was to require labeling of any foods produced or containing biotech ingredients. As you all probably are aware, the one thing, if you were a food manufacturer, that you do not want to happen is to have different laws on how your product has to be labeled in one state or one area versus another state or another area, because it kind of wreaks havoc on your production processes if you are in national distribution and your distribution channels, because you don't want to have 50 different labels that just, your distribution systems don't work that way. So there was a pretty concerted effort across a number of different entities for a national standard that would supersede any state laws. And in fact, that was passed in the Senate in July of 2016 as some compromise legislation. And what does that legislation say? The key provisions, first is federal preemption. So that means that up until the time that this goes into effect and between now and the time it goes into effect, no state law can supersede or pass a law on labeling of genetically modified ingredients. It gave USDA 2 years to develop a disclosure standard and to write regulations on that. So what's the best way of communicating with consumers this information? And it listed several options in the legislation, whether it would be through a QR code or actually appear on the package or some type of a symbol. So USDA is in the process now of working on those regulations. There also was talk in the legislation, and I believe that I just read something that FDA will be following up on this, some money to go against consumer education so that consumers have a better understanding of biotechnology and GMOs so that they will understand labeling better. Of interest to dairy, the legislation prohibits, and this is the legislative language, I wanted to make sure that I got it exactly right, prohibits the food derived from an animal, milk, meat, or eggs from being considered bioengineered just because the animal ate GM feed. So in the case of dairy, if a dairy cow eats genetically modified corn, that doesn't mean that the milk has to be labeled as genetically modified. It also says that food can't be considered not bioengineered just because the food is not required to bear a GE disclosure. I know that's a mouthful, and you almost have to read it 3 times to get what it's saying, but I think that is an important aspect of the legislation as well. Back to this topic of whether meat, milk, and eggs are genetically modified. Just that we've known for many years that neither the proteins nor DNA is ever detected in these animal products based on the feed that the animal ate. The proteins that are introduced through, and again, the proteins are very low levels as they appear in genetically modified feed. But the proteins that are introduced for these traits tend to be very highly digestible, and that's desirable if you're developing a genetically modified plant, because you want proteins that are broken up very easily in your genetic in the system, because you don't want problems with allergenicity. So most of these proteins are very highly digestible, and you can actually track, if you wanted to go through the GI tract of an animal, and you can see proteins being digested. So they do not show up, neither them nor the DNA, they don't show up in the animal products. And this middle article is one that is just going into publication right now, I think in the Journal of Animal Science, again, reinforcing the same conclusion. Let's talk for a minute, and then we'll try and close it off in terms of what's going on in the marketplace right now and some of those implications. Food industry is all across the board. If you don't believe me, you can just walk into any grocery store today and observe some of the labeling. Just to be clear, this marketplace labeling that's going on right now, that is marketplace labeling. It is not based on a federal mandate at this time. Non-GMO Project is the biggest verifier out there right now. They were kind of first to the trough here. They have different requirements than what's talked about in the federal legislation. They do not allow their seal to be used on animal products if those animals were fed genetically modified feed. They also don't allow if ingredients were made through fermentation with modified bacteria, or if they were, for example, if they were fed corn syrup as a nutrient stock for the fermentation process. So it's a very rigid scheme, but it has certainly grown. I've updated this slide 3 times in the last year or more because the staff keeps growing and the number of products in their scheme keeps growing. There are other labeling schemes out there, by the way, besides the Non-GMO Project, but that's the biggest one. It's gotten more complicated of late with Dannon's pledge to only use milk from cows that have been fed non-GMO ingredients. So I think a little frustrating for farmers who plant these ingredients, recognizing that their fields are more sustainable as a result of these technologies and being able to implement these technologies. But nevertheless, this is going on in the marketplace today. It is a minefield, though, and if you don't believe that, ask Chipotle and how messy it is when you start making some of these claims. There are a lot of people out there looking to file lawsuits, and it is a messy area to get out there and start making claims. I actually do have some optimism going forward, and if you look at media over the last year and 2 years, you are finding that GMOs are, at least among a lot of cutting-edge media, you're finding people talking about this more, and they're talking about it in a more positive way often, at least the people who, like I said, are more on the cutting-edge side. I figure when you got a geneticist on with Stephen Colbert talking about CRISPR, that's you're making some progress. So I do believe that consumers are going to be more informed as scientists become more conversant with media sources about this. Resources to watch for going forward as you get questions or talk with customers or clients. I know that Tricia's going to be sending out some resources to you as something that we're putting together, as well as a link to this if you wanted to access some of the information. IFIC has a lot of good information on their website, some things that are very consumer friendly if you wanted to share those in response to questions. U.S. Farmers and Ranchers through Food Dialogues, GMO Answers, those are all places where consumer-friendly information about this topic if you need that. I would like to call your attention very quickly to two upcoming documentaries, one called Food Evolution. I have had the opportunity and pleasure of reviewing an early copy of this. It's going to be released later this month. And it is excellent. It's narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson and really talks about this GMO movement and shows it was produced by the Institute of Food Technologists, but it's making its way into regular theaters, and I'm sure eventually will be streamed. So please watch out for that one, because the whole theme of that is science-based decision-making on issues related to food. Science Moms, I have not seen a preview of this, but it's supposed to be coming out very soon as well, and this is a group of, as you would guess, science moms. They blog and they have their own website, and basically they've said, we're just tired of this, we're not taking it anymore, and we are going to speak out as mothers who care about the future and care about science. So watch for that as well. Just my own little communication tips, and these could apply to a lot of different things. Always, I got a question recently about if you had time to give somebody one message, what would it be? And I said the first thing I would do is trying to listen to where the person was coming from, because you've got to meet people where they are. The old quote that is tossed around very often, people want to know you care before they care what you know. You're going to get a lot of yes/no questions. You don't have to answer yes or no to that. You can use that as a bridge to try and have an open conversation and then share your informed perspective. This is a very complicated topic. Try and keep it very simple and clear to the extent that you can. Tell stories when you can. And take advantage of the resources that we've talked about here. So with that, I do think we've got maybe a little more than 5-8 minutes for some questions. I'd be happy to respond. I apologize for going so fast, but I knew we didn't have too much time here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. Really a lot of great information, a strong overview that can really help us be more engaged in that biotechnology conversation. So with a few minutes, if you do have some questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, and Elliot on our team will field those to Lisa. If you don't have time or thoughts of questions right now, we certainly can be a resource moving forward. Lisa has offered to be a resource if needed. So just give a minute and see if there are any questions. And if not, we can wrap up.
Okay. Sure, a couple of questions have come in. First of all, somebody's asking, can you put the communications tip slide back up while we're going through the questions?
Yes, there it is.
Okay, and then first question came in early during the presentation. When Bt corn is consumed, does this mean we are eating Bt, a pesticide?
You may be eating, yes, depending on where it's expressed in the plant, but you are already consuming Bt if you eat organic produce, most likely. Bt has been present in the food supply for many, many years. As I said, it's kind of a staple for organic farmers. Typically in the, like if you're talking about corn, the Bt that would be expressed for corn rootworm expresses more in the roots, and you get very little in the ears of corn. And in the case of corn, for example, you would be typically not eating, most corn goes into feed or it goes into processed food, so you'd be in corn oil, you wouldn't have any protein in corn oil, or in corn syrup, you wouldn't have any protein in corn oil. But Bt is present in the food supply. It's a protein. It's broken down just like any other protein that you find in a, a steak or soybean or whatever.
Okay, and a related question that just came in as well is, I thought Bt corn couldn't be used in organic farming scented GMO. Is that correct?
Bt corn would not be used in organic farming, but Bt, the protein, and Bt stands for, it's an organism, it's a soil organism, and it expresses this protein. So Bt is used in organic farming over the top of produce. So it's applied or sprayed by organic farmers, or it may be that it is an approved insecticide for organic farming.
Okay, another question.
So those are the same compound, but two different ways of reaching the insect, if you will.
Okay, on a different topic, some folks are saying that gene editing technologies are harmful, seeing as CRISPR is a virus. Is this putting a virus in our food?
CRISPR is, my understanding, CRISPR is not putting a virus in the food. CRISPR is a technology that allows, to put it really simplistically, you can go in with micro scissors and cut out a gene segment, or put in or use RNA from the organism to perhaps amplify a particular gene, but I do not believe that it introduces viruses into the food supply. I would be happy to look into that more, but that is not my understanding based on what I've read of how the technology works.
What are the top 2 to 3 outcomes the IC expects to influence in 2017 to connect the benefits of biotechnology to dairy?
I think what the IC would like to see is informed discussion about the topic so that there is an even playing field. We don't have a view about whether a farmer, what type of farm a farmer should decide to run or operate. But we do believe that consumer trust is important. And so we want to make sure that consumers have the facts that they need to make informed decisions when they pull a product off a shelf. So I think that that's really what we'd like to see, is try and get information out there, whether it's through, work that the government is doing, whether it's what food companies are doing, whether it is what NGOs are doing, or the small piece that we play about, we need to be able to talk about agriculture. We need to be able to talk about agricultural technologies. Biotech is just one of those, so that consumers understand safeguards, that they understand benefits, and that they can make informed choices.
That's actually a great segue with a minute or so left. If there are additional questions, we can follow up on those via email. But to keep that conversation going and to keep ourselves engaged in the conversation and in educating consumers in that conversation, I just wanted to point to the fact on the next slide that we have recorded this webinar and we will be posting it on our website. Here is a screen grab of how you can get there. We have a Dairy Resource Center that is, you can see the box there on the upper right. If you click there and then see where the webinars are, that'll be where we will post this webinar so that you can either listen again or share it with others as you're continuing the conversation. You'll find our other consumer confidence webinars posted there as well. And then as a follow-up, as Lisa mentioned, there are some resources that we're going to be sending to you directly. So in a day or so, we'll be sending you a follow-up email. And so on the next slide, if you watch your email, you will see this thank you that comes your way. There will be a link to the recording as well as a link to a consumer FAQ that, again, will be a great resource for you to rely on if you're looking for ways to continue that conversation, and we'll also include some of the links to the resources that Lisa mentioned earlier with IFIC and GMO answers and things like that. There will also be information about how to apply for continuing education credits if that applies to you. So thanks to all of you for participating today. I know we're getting close to noon here. I want to encourage you to watch your emails for invitations for future webinars. We're going to be taking the summer off, but our next session is slated for September 19, and we're going to be talking about dairy farmers' commitment to sustainability and integrating a fun virtual farm tour. We're going to be visiting 3 farm tours throughout the Midwest via a video farm tour, and so that'll be something new that we're adding to our consumer confidence session. So again, as we get into noon, I want to just thank you all for listening in and for your support of these webinars, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.